This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Theodore Dalrymple his latest book, Admirable Evasions: How Psychology Undermines Morality. Theodore Dalrymple is a retired physician and psychiatrist. He is a contributing editor of City Journal and a frequent contributor to the London Spectator, the New Criterion, and other publications. His most recent book, Not With a Bang, But a Whimper, The Politics and Culture of Decline, and also of Romancing Opiates, Pharmacological Lies, and the Addiction Bureaucracy. Theodore, glad to have you on the program.
Well, thank you for having invited me.
I should also mention the many listeners of this podcast will note that you are a frequent contributor to Law and Liberty with pieces on a wide range of subjects, as we should expect, and they're always well received. So we thank you for that, and really excited to talk with you about this book. So let me just ask you a question on the subtitle of the book. How does modern psychology undermine morality?
Well, I think primarily it does so by distancing ourselves from our own behavior and our own decisions, because it makes us treat ourselves as if we were objects rather than subjects. As I said, I think it puts a kind of veil or screen between our consciousness, if you like, our conscious decision-making, and what we actually do. Incidentally, we only try to explain our bad behavior. We never try to explain our good behavior.
So do we become, in effect, we lose ownership, we lose sovereignty over our actions, over our responsibilities, and we see ourselves actually not as subjects of experts, as we cede our sovereignty to other people to tell us what we should do, to manage us, to guide us, inform us, rather than seeing ourselves as our own captains.
Yes, but we do that in retrospect. In prospect, of course, we always want to retain our freedom. So what we want really, underlining all this, the real reason that people indulge in this is that they want to be free, but free from responsibility. And that's a natural human propensity, and that's why I've quoted Shakespeare, who knew that perfectly well. That the title comes from a speech in Lear, and it's precisely about that Shakespeare is writing.
So the end of this soliloquy by Edmund in King Lear, which you take for your title, an admirable evasion of whoremaster man, to lay his goatish disposition to the charge of a star. So here we have something we would regard as foolish, that we could attribute our behavior as designed for us or controlled by planetary influence or something like that. And yet now you're saying that psychology largely steps in and fulfills the same role, only we don't understand that or explain it as such because it has the authority of science. It has the authority of empiricism to empirically explain us to ourselves and to others.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, and then essentially it's the same thing. But the mystery about ourselves remains, really. We don't understand ourselves any better than Shakespeare understood us, probably than the Greeks understood themselves. But because we have this kind of technological brio, and I don't want to disparage it in its proper place, it's absolutely wonderful. But there has been a repeated pattern for at least two centuries now, to assume that science has finally enabled us to understand ourselves so well that really nothing much remains of a mystery.
I want to, and just to be clear, I want to talk with you. You've alluded to that psychology can also be a good thing. As I'm reading this, I'm thinking of St. Augustine in the Confessions, which is, I think, a deeply psychological book in many ways. I mean, it's a theological book, and explaining how he converts to Christianity, and but the ways in which he examines himself, the introspection, the self-knowing, the humility of acknowledging the things that he's done wrong in life. This could be psychology at its best, I assume.
Yes.
I mean, I assume that's really the soulful inquisition of ourselves.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And I think if we are honest, something similar to St. Augustine or many other writers is available to us. And actually, we are almost prevented from that kind of self-examination by psychological explanations as they are peddled by various schools of psychology.
So and you walk through kind of the major schools of psychology, beginning with psychoanalysis. And I just wanted to read briefly your description of psychoanalysis and then get your reaction, maybe further elaboration on this passage. But also, I think just historically, the jumping off point of psychoanalysis. So you say, psychoanalysis is not so much reflection as a kind of shallow Gnostic divination. It starts off with the hypothesis that all thoughts are born equal, at least in deeper psychological significance, and that the conscious attempt to discipline them, to winnow the true from the false, the important from the trivial, the useful from the useless, actually inhibits or prevents the achievement of self-knowledge. I guess my question, why psychoanalysis? Why does it arise? What is it replacing that it achieves this sort of power in the Western mind?
Well, I suppose it was an attempt to overthrow a rather shallow associationism and a view that consciousness is all important. One can, of course, psychoanalyze Freud, if you like, and look into his biography to see what it was that he was personally trying to do. But he, in my view, didn't discover anything. And everything, those parts of, he reminds me, really, his writings remind me of what Dr. Johnson said of somebody's book. Your book is both true and original, but where it is original, it is not good. Your book is both good and original, but where it is good, it is not original, and where it is original, it is not good. So I think that he was actually a founder of a movement more than a scientist.
Talk about that movement, because I guess I'm interested in thinking through, one, the power of science and the general explanations that you're talking about psychology gives us, but also the susceptibility, it seems, of democratic societies, of lowercase l liberal democratic societies to these sorts of explanations, and just thinking about what we talked about at the beginning of being willing to cede our sovereignty to the experts.
Well, I think there's also a desire to achieve a theory that explains everything to us. Otherwise, we seem to live in just a chaos of events which are not understandable and so on. And so we want an all-explanatory theory. Marxism is an obvious example of that. And Freud was just Freudianism was an example of this desire for an all-encompassing explanation. Now, Freud was originally a very good neuroscientist. He was a very good neuroanatomist. The reason he went into psychiatry and psychology was that he needed to make a living, and he couldn't make a living as a neuroscientist in Vienna of those days. But he had absorbed a scientific world outlook and claimed that his method was scientific, when of course it bore almost no relationship to science at all. And in fact, I think the whole idea of science in regard to some of the problems that he was trying or claimed to be trying to unravel are not susceptible to scientific explanation.
Do you mean when you say that, you primarily refer to his theory of the unconsciousness, or?
Well, I mean, I don't think that any scientific explanation of human life and experience is ever going to satisfy us, or is ever going to be true, actually.
Yes. Well, you say psychology teaches us that we are, in effect, shallow, powerless, mindless beings. And then I love this quote you have. It encourages self-absorption without self-examination. I guess I was thinking in particular with regard to psychoanalysis, kind of maybe work those two things together, because I'm thinking talking on the couch endlessly about yourself, but not really getting anywhere. I suppose that's exactly what you're describing here.
Yes, and of course it gives a kind of significance to the very tiny shifts in your emotions, in your thoughts, and so on and so forth, when all around you there's a whole world waiting for examination. And so I have observed, and I haven't done this scientifically, but I have observed that people who've undergone psychoanalysis, and the longer they've undergone it, the worse it is, they seem to have this shallow self-absorption, which I don't really approve.
Yeah.
In the book, I do actually quote a whole section of a psychoanalysis as relayed by an author who underwent 4,000 sessions of psychoanalysis. 4,000 sessions.
It's funny. I mean, as I'm listening to you describe this, I suppose I'm thinking. There are a lot of thoughts, but one is this idea of just completely disregard other people as a path to health, to sanity, to any sort of regularity, that you really aren't other regarding at all. And in that case, maybe Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments should be what the psychologist might prescribe to actually situate yourself among your neighbors. Would be a better way of thinking than any of this.
Well, I think so, but of course the parents loom rather large in psychoanalysis, and they are often blamed for everything. But there is, as I said, it does seem to me that they become analysans become self-absorbed in this trivial way.
Do you see this effect? And we've been talking about psychoanalysis, other schools of psychology working as well, has really contributing to and just connecting this maybe to law and politics as really part of the somnolescence of Western liberal democracies, these sort of paralysis we see where they really don't seem to be able to address their problems. And there are many problems looming, particularly in European countries. Thinking about really taking the rigor or the motive or the action away from citizens and political actors, because you actually start to believe maybe you can't do anything. Is there a connection there? I mean, I guess that's such a broad statement, but it seems to fit in with what you're describing.
I think it's a tenuous description. I mean, in a way, it suits power-hungry politicians, because, of course, if people ascribe everything to structures or phenomena outside themselves, then it's up to somebody else to come and put things right. If I may refer to a very simple semantic shift, I heard thousands of people, literally thousands of people, claim to be depressed. I think in the last 15 years of my career, I heard about 3 people say that they were unhappy. And this is a very important shift, because what it means is that the person who says, I'm depressed, thinks of himself as suffering from an illness. And if he's suffering from an illness, obviously it is the duty of doctors or somebody else to make him better. If he is suffering from unhappiness, He can be suffering from unhappiness because he's being very badly treated, or because he's behaving very foolishly, has very bad habits. All kinds of things can make you unhappy. But they do, to say that you are unhappy does put an onus on you to do something about it, whereas saying I'm depressed means that I'm handing the problem over to someone else, to some expert, and he will make it better. And if you listen to people on trains and buses, as I'm afraid I'm a bit of an eavesdropper, you hear them talking about their neurotransmitters, as if their neurotransmitters explain their unhappiness, their bad behavior, whatever it is.
I suppose in a way what you're describing is largely the eclipse of people understanding themselves as free. Or telling themselves that they're perfectly free to do any number of things, but not really seeing that freedom actually comes through kind of a rigorous discipline, courage, pride, etc.
Yes, and of course they're this is a position of, should I say, bad faith, because they know at one level they know that they're free, and they wouldn't want their freedom interfered with before the bad consequences of the way they've behaved make themselves evident. But as soon as the bad consequences become evident, then they ascribe it to something outside themselves. Nobody ever came to me and said, well, doctor, why am I so nice to people? Or why do I drink in moderation?
Yeah.
And no one has ever asked me that.
But you connected to this, you have a discussion about behavioralism, and behavioralism, neuroscience. You're right, encourages this distinction between the apparent me and the real me, and then of course you draw this to a weakening of criminal law. Of punishment, generally speaking, precisely what we've been discussing, society and government, really are the things that are active here, not my agency, not me being responsible for my actions. But the apparent me and the real me, there's really no way to even talk about any sort of idea of self-government. In that regard, if just thinking about broader questions, broader picture here, if that's my understanding, the understanding would actually be technical administration from government of subjects.
Yes, well, I suppose there's the hope that once everything is all right, I will automatically behave well and be happy.
And this is rooted, you note this is rooted in the European Union's constitution at some level? Of a rehabilitative theory of punishment?
Yes,
that was news to me.
Yes, well, that arose when there were several British murderers who had been sentenced to life imprisonment, meaning life. They would never be released, and I think it was 4 of them appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. To claim that this was cruel punishment and against their fundamental human rights, with which the European Court of Human Rights actually fundamentally agreed, because they said everybody should have the hope of rehabilitation and remorse and so on. The 4 murderers, I won't describe what they did, but they were not. They were very terrible things that they'd done, and in one case at least repeatedly, 2 cases repeatedly. And so this implied that the purpose of punishment is actually treatment. And the problem with punishment as treatment is that it is compatible both with the most ludicrous leniency and the most draconian severity. And it is completely against the rule of law, actually, because punishment should be determinate, and it makes punishment completely indeterminate. I'm actually against parole for that reason. I think parole makes punishment indeterminate. It makes them dependent on speculation of what people will do in the future, which is inherently unknowable, rather than what they have done in the past.
On this question of punishment, or punishment as rehabilitation, is that is tied in, though? It seems to me a lot of this is tied into just the refusal to acknowledge or to call out inequalities, to in effect say to someone, to speak with authority, what you have done is completely unacceptable, and demands X punishment, precisely because there's this all-encompassing notion of human equality that even now extends to the realm of heinous acts and crimes being seen in a different light.
Yes, well, they're explained in psychological or sociological or criminological fashion.
Yeah.
But of course, there's also an element, I suppose, of a kind of debased Christianity in it, that everyone is capable of being, or should be, accessible to forgiveness. But I think that, of course, is to mistake the realm of forgiveness.
To confuse also the forgiveness with also the role of the state as a trustee of public order.
Yes.
Yes. Thinking here, the idea.
So may I just say
Sure.
that what was particularly alarming about the European court's view, it didn't actually say that someone couldn't be kept in prison for the rest of his life. It didn't go as far as that. What it said was that everyone must have the hope of release. But of course that can be very cruel, because if in fact you've no intention ever of releasing them, to give them the hope of release is actually cruel. A man can get on with his life if he knows that he's now gone to prison and that's his life. And he can accommodate that. What he can't accommodate is actually repeated disappointment of the hope to be released. But what was really terrible, in my view, about the court's reasoning was that on this continent, in which within living memory, or just about living memory, 50 million people have been killed, for them not to be able to conceive of a crime so terrible that it means that it puts someone beyond the pale as far as any civilized society is concerned, for them not to be able to conceive that, it shows how how brutal they are.
There's a some sort of religion of humanitarianism. As I listened to you describe that, you talk a lot about the idea of self-esteem. In Western culture, and as I'm reading that, I'm thinking to myself, as I was growing up, how many times I was told about the importance of self-esteem, in any number of pursuits that I engaged in. Self-esteem was the key. You said it's a psychological invention, namely that I should feel good about asserting myself, regardless of what it is that I'm doing or achieving. That seems right on, and that no one previously discussed the idea of self-esteem. Prior to this sort of intervention in our society, no one would ever think of themselves as needing to have self-esteem. You were in effect judged by your actions, and that was it.
Yes, and you had self-respect, which is a very different thing from self-esteem. Self-respect is something which is other-regarding, and is something which requires a discipline. For example, I use the example of how you dress. To dress in a pleasing way to others is self-respect. Self-esteem means I can dress any way I like, and nobody can say you're a slob to me, because that's an assault on my self-esteem.
Yeah.
To which I'm entitled, of course. A man is entitled. I mean, the American Declaration of Independence, if it has any faults, it fails to include self-esteem in the list unalienable human rights.
So what's the fallout from the fallout from self-esteem is what exactly? I mean, democratic societies actually need people to have this sort of, what one view could be it needs people to feel like they have dignity in all situations. So what's the fallout from self-esteem?
Well, the fact is that I can behave any way I like, and I'm entitled to feel good about myself. And furthermore, there's a kind of intimidating nature of the whole concept of self-esteem. It's not just that I want to feel good about myself, however I behave, however useless I am, however slobbishly I behave. I demand of others that they confirm my self-esteem by not upsetting me.
Did you see a lot of prisoners when you were presiding as a psychiatrist having inordinately high levels of self-esteem?
Oh yes, they were very pleased with themselves, at least until they bethought themselves, and most of them did eventually bethink themselves. But often they were extremely pleased with what they'd done, and they walked around, they swaggered. Of course, in a sense, they have to swagger, because if they don't, then they become victims of other people. So it's, in some respects, it was a facade, but nevertheless, there was a genuine self-esteem there, as if they had done something very good.
I was thinking, just along these lines, you've written very well about the underclass in Britain, and sort of the just completely antisocial nature of behavior and life amongst this cross-section of people in the United Kingdom. How does this connect up with what you're saying? Have you thought about that with what you're writing here in Modern Psychology? Is it the case that those without the social and moral capital of, say, middle class or upper class in Britain are even more plagued by this sort of psychological thinking here, even though they might not articulate it as such?
Yes. Well, the first thing I want to say is that I'm not really keen on the idea of the underclass as such, as if it were just 5% of the population, which was different completely from the rest of the population. I think that is not so. It's not just a tiny proportion of the population that is living very wretchedly, which is unfortunate for it, but doesn't affect the rest of society very much. I don't think that is true.
Okay.
So that in Britain, for example, just take a manifestation of the kind of thing that I deplore, and that is public drunkenness, which has become a horrible manifestation in Britain of a kind of inflamed egotism. And if you talk to people, usually after they've been terribly drunk, because you won't get a coherent answer while they are terribly drunk, or perhaps before they're completely terribly drunk, if you ask them why they do it, they give you a psychological explanation. And that psychological explanation has a kind of psychoanalytic flavor to it, and that is that they have to express themselves, that they have to let out whatever it is within them in the public sphere. They have to express themselves, and that if they didn't express themselves, then if they control themselves, on the contrary, whatever it is that was within them that they were trying to express would turn septic, as it were, like kind of emotional septicemia, and they would be far worse themselves. So, and the kind of ultimate example, which I've given before, of that kind of thinking is a man who had just murdered his girlfriend, who said to me, "I had to kill her, doctor, or I don't know what I would have done."
Oh my God.
Which I said something serious, perhaps. But and it's that kind of theory which has actually seeped down throughout the whole of our society, meaning that what was formerly regarded as good, namely self-control, has now come to seem bad. It's a form of treachery to the self.
It's a form. Yes. No. I suppose. Yeah. When you think about this, it's, virtue being a habit, a disposition, should become not easy, but it's not exactly something you think about. You just sort of do it. Right? I mean, that's what Aristotle describes. And I suppose if you have not had your passions or your appetites, if you've not been taught to regulate those properly, I suppose it comes to be seen as a very hateful thing, as an unwelcome intervention, that you would regulate yourself.
Yes, I mean, one of the problems in Britain that I've noticed is terrible littering. People throw their litter all over the place. It sometimes seems as if people in Britain now can't go to a beautiful place without throwing a can of something or other at it, or a bottle of something, or they've been eating all the time and they just throw their litter at it. And I thought, well, why don't I do it? And I don't do it because every time I could do it, I have this moral discussion with myself, trying to find the Cartesian point from which I can argue undoubtedly that it is wrong to throw litter at, or throw litter in the street or whatever. It's really because my mother told me not to. And what she told me to do became a habit, and I subsequently realized that there was a reason for it. But she didn't start at the age of 3 telling me not to leave things because of those reasons. And there's an increasing inability to accept any regulation, any limits that one doesn't either set for oneself or decide are completely rational. And of course, limits are very rarely completely rational.
You and I, we had a discussion previously, and you were describing to me the sort of self-transport vehicles that are provided to people by the government for people who are overweight.
Yes.
I mean, that in a sense, I suppose this goes on and on and on, in the sense of the way the government previously, as we were discussing, can actually compensate for this lack of responsible behavior, can endlessly supply ways to ease it, I suppose. Which, I mean, you'll be walking down the street and you'll see someone obviously overweight, fairly young, but go by on one of these vehicles on the side of the street. I thought that was hilarious and sad at the same time.
Well, it is very sad because their lives really are very limited by it. So one must have sympathy and understanding for these people, but the problem is that they are lied to from very early on in their lives about their own lack of control over their own behavior. Instead, you might be interested. See, I saw that a headline. I didn't read the story, but a woman in Britain who had done something bad, I don't know, and would normally have been sent to prison, was not sent to prison because she was deemed too fat.
So they couldn't accommodate her. There's a fairly, I mean, I suppose the entire book could be received as controversial. But even more so, you step up to controversy in the latter part of the book in talking about the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs, Prozac being the first and maybe the most widely prescribed, but also a conversation about the nature of drug use and the addiction of drug use and the very casual assumption. Certainly, I mean, I remember being taught this growing up. This is an addiction. It's deeply rooted in these people. We can't be angry or judge them. And then you make the observation that I always thought about is people go off these drugs all the time, particularly when there's the threat of the loss of family or even the ability to take care of yourself. People all of a sudden seem to come to and stop the bad behavior. Yet we think of this as an addiction. And it's tied to a certain percentage of the population by consequence, and yet drug use is really a growth industry, as you note in one part of the book, which would seem to belie that.
Yes. Well, I think the whole conception of addiction, which officially, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, is a chronic relapsing brain disease and nothing else.
Yes.
There's nothing else to it. It's just a physiological condition that, it seems to me, if you believe it, is, and if the population believes it, is going to excuse them in advance, if I may so put it, for anything that they do with regard to drugs.
So
it's a built-in excuse.
Interesting. I mean, as I was thinking about tying your observation about this being a behavior, subject to any number of influences, and of course, as you say, heroin, I think was the drug you mentioned in the book. People typically, it takes them 18 months to become addicted to heroin. So they have to try hard to become addicted to heroin, which is an interesting thing. But, thinking, in America, attitudes towards liberalizing our drug prohibition laws keep opening. People seem to be open to that. A number of states are now allowing the use of marijuana. But does this mean, if you're right, that actually what we could be opening ourselves up to is really high rates of drug use, potentially, if this is tied to a behavior and the behaviors are sort of deeply embedded in the way we talk and explain and think about our responsibilities, and maybe what we're really getting into is a lot of drug use.
Well, there are two main arguments, I think, for liberalization, and the first is a philosophical one, that it is not the duty of the government to tell people what they can take and what they can't take. They are the captains of their soul, as it were, and they have this liberty to do what they wish. And I would have more sympathy with that if it was easy to make them take the consequences of their decision. But it's actually very difficult to get people to take the consequences of their decisions. Anyway, that is the argument. And the practical argument is that some of the undesirable phenomena around drug addiction, for example, criminality and so forth, are the consequence of illegality and not of the drug or drugs themselves. And I actually think that would only the only way in which those consequences could be avoided on that argument is a completely free market, that you had all drugs available on the same basis as you can buy chocolate or some other commodity. And that doesn't seem to me to be very likely. I mean, I can't see you just going down to your shop and asking for your ketamine and your...
From a vending machine.
From a vending machine, yes.
No,
it doesn't seem plausible to me.
No, I largely agree with that. I guess I was just sort of thinking, because what you actually open us up to, which I think most people don't talk about or admit, is the rather explosive nature of potentially of drug use, and the reasons, because we think about it in terms of a purely medical condition, and your analysis opens it up to it being so much more. On returning though just to the question of the Prozac and the SSRIs, this truly was. I remember the first time I heard about Prozac 20 years ago or so. This was a really massive medical intervention in our societies, largely done, with the blessing of governments, but very entrepreneurial on behalf of drug companies, and convincing people, and you document this in the book, that this would be the solution to their being depressed, quote unquote. And now it is so widespread. We've got 10-15% of the population at any one moment on these drugs to manage and affect their moods.
Yes. Well, if I remember rightly, there was a bestseller. I can't remember the exact year it was published now, but by a psychiatrist called Peter Kramer, who was a respected man and a sensible man, but he implied in his book, which, as I said, was a bestseller, that we could now almost design our own personalities or characters through the use of drugs that alter neurochemicals. And in fact, we can be made better than well by these drugs, so that he quotes cases, if I remember rightly, sometimes as I've read the book, he quotes cases where people feel on the drugs that they're better than they've ever been in their whole lives. So actually what they've lacked in their whole lives is these drugs. And it reminds me of the corny old joke about the man who goes to the surgeon. He's injured his hand and says, "Doctor, will I be able to play the piano after the surgery?" And he says, "Yes, I should think so." And he said, "Well, that's funny. I never could before." And and that was the kind of impression given by the book Listening to Prozac. But of course, if you change all unhappiness into depression and say that there's a drug that will treat depression, then obviously you've got a bit of a bestseller, since mankind is permanently dissatisfied.
And it's it's a chemical imbalance in my brain that can be easily corrected.
Yes,
Sure
and I don't have to alter the way I live or anything like that. I just take a pill and continue as before. Incidentally, the evidence that these pills actually work is pretty slender.
Do you see, as a psychiatrist, have you started to see a pushback in this regard? That's, I really haven't. It
Only
seems to
by
me,
me.
what I see are nonstop commercials on behalf of these drugs still, or magazine advertisements. And it seems to be just sort of commonly accepted that, you're going to need it from time to time.
Yes. Well, I've tried to push back a little bit myself, and I must say that in my practice I spent much more time trying to get people to stop taking drugs, because once you start prescribing drugs for people, they automatically assume that they have an illness. Otherwise, why would you prescribe it? And the problem with that is that the kind of dance you do with the patient can go on for months, if not years, because you can alter the dose. And fortunately, there are a large number of different drugs you can take, and each one can't be shown not to have worked in less than 3 months. So actually, you can go on like this for months or years, and then when finally it doesn't work, it's very difficult to say, well, actually, I don't think there's anything medically wrong with you. And of course, the whole question is muddied. The waters are muddied by the placebo effect. So very few patients don't feel a little better on the drug. So you don't know whether they feel better because there's a genuine response or because there's a placebo response.
So the patient brings, just based on, everything he's heard or she's heard, they come to the drug expecting it to work. The one thing they need, yes. So
although it doesn't, the fact is it doesn't work for most people. I do think there is a condition of melancholia which has been recognized for thousands of years, really. But it's not a terribly common condition, and people do actually get better on drugs with that condition.
I want to hit two, I guess, new schools of thought that you discuss at the end of the book: neuroscience, and I suppose I say new. Just in terms of many intellectuals and many in the profession of psychology using it as a way to explain people to themselves. I suppose neuroscience is it's tied into the SSRI revolution, but also increasingly neo-Darwinism. We see Matt Ridley and others who kind of use this as a justification, interesting to my mind, for libertarian free market policies. But neo-Darwinism rising in an explanation of who we are and how we should act, evolution being actually the key. You have some discussion on this in the book, but how does this tie in overall, though, to psychology? Is this changing the way people think about who they are?
Well, yeah, there are, of course, there is a school of Darwinian or neo-Darwinian psychology, which is claiming to explain us to ourselves. But again, I don't think it does. And there are, I quote one or two absurd examples of this, admittedly not the latest, but I think there are metaphysical reasons why these explanations will always be absurd.
The idea being we act the ways that we do. You discussed deception, but I mean a lot of this you see is to further our genes, to expand our gene pool. It's kind of doesn't make sense to most people, and sidelining our consciousness. This is not the thing that matters. It's a leftover from evolution.
Yes, I think the idea that we are just gene maximizing mechanisms as a description of human life is absurdly reductive and empirically ridiculous, frankly. And I think there are, as I said, metaphysical reasons why no explanation of that kind will ever satisfy us about or explain us to ourselves. Incidentally, I have no theory myself to explain us to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I wanted just to briefly read your quote. This is on page 107 about evolution. If evolution is a directionless, purposeless natural phenomenon that is all explanatory, then human behavior just is. It is neither moral nor immoral. If, on the other hand, it is moral or immoral, then either the process of evolution is directed by a moral intelligence in the direction of a greater morality, or the process of evolution is not all explanatory and has led to something that escapes it, namely human conceptions of morality. Incidentally, also language. Language seems hard to understand just through evolution, it seems to me. But I appreciated that quote, putting things rightly, it seems.
Yes. Yes, I think that the fact is that we make judgments, both aesthetic and moral, and I don't think anyone can go through the world actually without making such judgments. I don't think you can go even a few minutes without making such judgments. Life is judgment. And sorry,
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
And the fact is that when we make a judgment, we think that we are referring to some kind of objective reality. And that's inescapable for human beings, I think. Yeah. And if that is the case, then no purely naturalistic theory of man will ever fully explain or illuminate his life. And I say that without being religious myself. I have no better theory. I have no all-encompassing theory to propound. I'm just saying that we should recognize when we're in the presence of a mystery which we can't fully explain, we should recognize that rather than pretend that finally we have understood it, as repeatedly has happened in the history of psychology. I quote at the beginning of the book a physician called Cabanis, who said that the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile, with the implication that really all investigation is just filling in the details now. There's nothing else to be explained, really. Everything is known, and we just need the details. And that is a repeated pattern in psychological thought.
You close the book with an appeal to literature as needed as doing a much better job than a visit to your psychologist. That what you should do is pick up Jane Austen or Samuel Johnson or other writers to understand human beings in all of their dimensions and tension and drama. These are ways to actually think about ourselves that are actually truthful. And one particular Rasselas by Samuel Johnson has providing perhaps a cure of human experience, overcoming, rising above any sort of rather simple explanations of who we are, because who we are is just so diverse and manifold.
Yes, and we are prey to contradictory desires. So the last chapter of Rasselas, he says that this is a conclusion in which nothing is concluded. He argues that there is no perfect existence for man, that every form of existence for man has it, because of our contradictory desires, has its drawbacks and its disappointments. And oddly enough, this is not a depressing conclusion. Once you realize that, it's consolatory, and you don't expect life to be nothing but a festival of joy. And once you've accepted that, your life does actually become better.
No, that's I think that's incredibly important to realize, and to also to appreciate the helps that we are given in life, like family, or the community around you, the relationships you form, and all of their difficulties and but also all of their love and belonging. Those things become significant. Thank you so much for your time today. We've been talking with Theodore Dalrymple, the author of Admirable Evasions, How Psychology Undermines Morality. Very much appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.